In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the concrete bunker known as WW62 sat in darkness above Omaha Beach. From its narrow embrasures, the English Channel looked calm, almost indifferent. Inside, a young German machine gunner prepared his weapon with the methodical care of a man who believed history was on his side. He had been told the Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. He had been assured that any invasion would be crushed at the waterline. Senior commanders had inspected the defenses personally, tracing fields of fire with confident gestures, promising that this stretch of coast would become a graveyard for any force foolish enough to land here. This belief was not limited to one bunker or one soldier. It was the product of 4 years of propaganda, engineering, and assumption. From Norway to the Bay of Biscay, Germany had poured unimaginable resources into concrete, steel, and mines. Millions of cubic meters of fortifications scarred the coastline. Entire divisions were stationed behind them, trained to believe they were the guardians of an impregnable fortress. The Atlantic Wall was not just a defensive system. It was an idea, a promise that the Reich could hold the line indefinitely, that the enemy would never dare to challenge it directly. The confidence rested on calculations. German officers measured beach gradients, tidal flows, and kill zones. They counted bunkers, artillery pieces, and machine gun nests. They plotted overlapping fire that would turn any landing into slaughter. At Omaha Beach alone, the defenses appeared overwhelming. Obstacles bristled in the tidal flats, many rigged with mines. Behind them, concrete strongpoints commanded every approach. Artillery batteries waited inland, ready to pour fire onto the sand. On paper, the mathematics favored the defender, but mathematics depends on assumptions, and the first of those assumptions collapsed before dawn. On June 5th, German meteorologists had declared the weather unsuitable for invasion. High winds churned the channel, heavy seas smashed against the coast, low clouds smothered visibility. Based on this forecast, commanders relaxed. Senior officers left their posts. Units stood down from full alert. Even the commander responsible for defending northern France departed for Germany, confident nothing would happen for weeks. The Atlantic Wall, it seemed, would not be tested that night. What German forecasters did not know was that Allied meteorologists were seeing a different picture. Weather stations far out in the Atlantic detected a brief break in the storm, a narrow window measured in hours, not days. It was a risk. Conditions would still be rough, but it was the only chance. The decision was made. The largest amphibious invasion in history would go forward into wind, waves, and uncertainty. Shortly before midnight, German radar stations along the French coast began detecting unusual activity. Large aerial formations appeared on screens, moving in from the north. At first, operators assumed it was another deception raid. Allied aircraft had done this before, probing defenses, forcing alerts, then vanishing. Reports filtered up the chain, but nothing triggered immediate alarm. Then the reports changed. Paratroopers were landing inland, or so it seemed. Some units reported drops to the east, others to the west. Some claimed the troops were British, others American. Explosions echoed in the darkness. Flares lit up the countryside. Dummy paratroopers dropped to confuse defenders, added to the chaos. German units fired at shadows, unsure what was real and what was not. Requests for permission to counterattack were delayed or denied. Orders came back telling units to wait until the situation clarified. For officers trained to act decisively, the paralysis was maddening. Every minute lost gave the enemy time to organize. Yet the German command system, rigid and centralized, froze under uncertainty. As the night wore on, confusion spread faster than information. Communications broke down. Telephone lines went dead. Radio traffic grew chaotic. By the time the truth began to emerge, it was already too late. Just after first light, observers along the coast saw something that defied comprehension. The horizon was no longer empty. From end to end, the channel was filled with ships. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands warships, landing craft, transports, and support vessels moved steadily toward the beaches. The sea itself seemed to have turned gray with steel. For soldiers raised on claims of Allied weakness, the sight was psychologically crushing. This was not a raid. This was not a probe. This was the arrival of an entire industrial civilization, crossing the sea in formation. At approximately 5:30 a.m., the bombardment began. Naval gunfire erupted with a violence unlike anything the defenders had experienced. Battleships and cruisers opened fire with shells the size of small cars. The earth shook, concrete cracked, bunkers designed to withstand anything short of direct hits were split open. Men were buried alive, dug out, and buried again as the barrage continued. The air filled with dust, smoke, and shockwaves that disoriented even seasoned veterans. The belief in the Atlantic Wall began to crumble under the weight of high explosives. Fortifications that had inspired absolute confidence were revealed as fragile against sustained naval fire. The psychological damage was immediate. If the wall could be broken this easily, what else had they been wrong about? Above the beaches, Allied aircraft filled the sky. Bombers struck inland targets. Fighters patrolled relentlessly. The promised German air response never came. Orders went out for every available aircraft to attack the invasion fleet. The reality was brutal. The Luftwaffe could muster only a handful of planes in the critical hours. Against thousands of Allied sorties, German pilots appeared briefly, fired what they could, and disappeared under overwhelming opposition. Air superiority, once a cornerstone of German warfare, had evaporated. At around 6:30 a.m., the first assault waves hit the beaches. Landing craft lowered their ramps into surf churned by explosions. Men poured out under fire, struggling through water and obstacles. German machine guns opened up, cutting lanes through the attackers. On Omaha Beach, where bombardment had failed to neutralize several key positions, the killing was intense. Units were pinned down, casualties mounted. The sand became a chaos of smoke, shattered equipment, and wounded men. From the perspective of the defenders, it must have seemed that their calculations were finally being proven right. The beach was a killing field. The fire was devastating, but something was wrong. The enemy did not stop coming. For every landing craft destroyed, more appeared. For every wave cut down, another followed. Naval gunfire shifted targets with terrifying precision, silencing positions that revealed themselves. Destroyers crept closer to shore, firing directly into bunkers at point-blank range. What had been theoretical support became immediate, overwhelming intervention. By mid-morning, a new reality set in. Ammunition stocks began to run low. Defensive plans had assumed limited assaults repelled quickly. They had not accounted for hours of continuous combat against an enemy who seemed to have endless supplies. Artillery batteries that were supposed to dominate the beaches found themselves rationing shells. By afternoon, some guns were reduced to firing only a few rounds per day. The imbalance was stark. German observers watched Allied ships expend hundreds of shells on single targets, while their own guns fell silent for lack of ammunition. Roads leading inland were swept by fighter bombers, making resupply nearly impossible. Units fought on, but the foundation of their defense was eroding beneath them. Meanwhile, the armored reserves that were supposed to crush the invasion at the shoreline remained immobilized. Orders were delayed. Authority was fragmented. When tanks finally moved, it was hours too late. By the time counterattacks reached the coast, Allied forces were already digging in, supported by armor, artillery, and an unbroken flow of reinforcements. As the day progressed, German soldiers began experiencing something they had never known before. Not defeat, but inevitability. No matter how bravely they fought, the outcome no longer seemed tied to their actions. The enemy's numbers kept growing. The firepower kept intensifying. The sea kept delivering more men, more vehicles, more supplies. This was not a battle of maneuver or tactics. It was a collision with industrial reality. By nightfall on June 6, the Atlantic Wall had been breached in multiple places. Entire strongpoints were destroyed or isolated. Communications were shattered. Units acted blindly, without coordination. The Luftwaffe was absent. The Navy was powerless. The carefully constructed image of German invincibility lay in ruins. The soldiers who survived that first day understood something their leaders had failed to grasp. They were no longer fighting another army. They were facing the output of factories, shipyards, and assembly lines on a scale beyond anything Germany could match. Courage and skill still mattered, but they were being drowned beneath a tide of material superiority. On the beaches of Normandy, the future of warfare revealed itself in brutal clarity, and it did not belong to those who built the strongest walls, but to those who could produce the most steel, the most ships, the most ammunition, and replace every loss without pause. The men in the bunkers had believed the invasion would be thrown back into the sea. Instead, they watched the sea deliver an enemy that could not be stopped. By the end of June 6th, the war in the West had changed forever. As darkness fell over Normandy on the night of June 6th, German commanders attempted to make sense of a situation that no training exercise or war plan had prepared them for. Reports from the coast were fragmentary and often contradictory. Some strongpoints claimed they were still holding, others had gone silent entirely. Entire battalions seemed to vanish from the command map, not destroyed, but simply unreachable. Telephone lines lay cut, radios crackled with interference or nothing at all. The carefully constructed command structure of the German army in the West was unraveling under pressure. The invasion had not ended with the beach landings. It was accelerating. Throughout the night, Allied ships continued to unload men and equipment with relentless efficiency. Engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles and mark exits from the beaches. Vehicles that had been expected to clog the sand for days were moving inland within hours. Casualties were evacuated, replacements stepped forward, and the flow never stopped. To the defenders watching from shattered positions, it appeared as if the enemy was immune to loss. Where one unit fell, another instantly replaced it. German attempts to regroup revealed the full extent of Allied dominance. Movement by road became nearly impossible. Fighter bombers prowled continuously, attacking anything that moved. Columns that tried to advance under cover of darkness were illuminated by flares and destroyed by artillery fire from the sea. Survivors described the experience as fighting an invisible enemy who saw everything. One of the most striking features of the first night was the paralysis of German armor. The units that had been intended as the decisive counterstroke remained scattered and uncertain. Orders passed slowly up and down the chain of command, constrained by rigid authority and fear of acting without explicit permission. By the time tanks finally moved toward the front, Allied positions were already too strong, too deep, and too well supported to be dislodged. At dawn on June 7th, the scale of the disaster became clearer. Allied forces were not clinging to narrow beachheads as expected. They were expanding them. Artillery was being brought ashore. Supply dumps were forming behind the lines. Engineers were repairing roads and bridges almost as quickly as they were damaged. What had begun as an invasion was transforming into occupation. German artillery units reported catastrophic losses. Many batteries had been located and destroyed by naval gunfire or air attack. Others were forced to abandon positions due to lack of ammunition. The carefully calculated fire plans that had once promised to annihilate any landing force were now meaningless. Without shells, guns were nothing more than abandoned steel. The psychological impact on German soldiers deepened with every passing hour. For years they had been told that the Western Allies lacked the will to fight. The democracies could not sustain prolonged war. That industrial output was meaningless without discipline and courage. Normandy shattered these beliefs completely. What they faced was not hesitation, but overwhelming coordination. Not chaos, but logistical mastery. Behind the lines, airborne troops compounded the sense of collapse. Paratroopers appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. Bridges were blown. Road junctions were seized. Units hesitated to move, fearing ambush. Rumors spread faster than facts. Entire formations held their positions, waiting for orders that never came, convinced that enemy forces were already behind them. Attempts to counterattack on June 7 and 8 met with limited success and heavy losses. Where German armor did advance, it encountered new weapons and tactics that seemed to belong to a different era of warfare. Mine-clearing tanks, armored flamethrowers, and specialized engineering vehicles reduced obstacles that had taken months to build. Defensive systems designed for static warfare collapsed under mobile combined arms assault. Every German loss was irreplaceable. Every Allied loss was temporary. As days passed, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Allied supply figures climbed steadily. Thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food were unloaded daily. Entire divisions arrived fully equipped, ready to fight. German units, by contrast, fought with dwindling strength. Reinforcements moved slowly, harassed constantly, and arrived exhausted and under strength, if they arrived at all. One German officer described the realization with brutal clarity: they were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to survive, one day at a time, against an enemy who grew stronger with each sunrise. By mid-June, key objectives began to fall. Towns that had been expected to hold for weeks collapsed in days. Defensive lines bent, then broke. Allied forces linked beachheads, eliminating gaps and creating a continuous front. What had been hoped for as isolated lodgements turned into an unbroken invasion corridor. German High Command issued increasingly desperate orders: hold at all costs, counterattack immediately, do not retreat. But these commands ignored reality on the ground. Units no longer had the men, the ammunition, or the freedom of movement to execute them. Courage alone could not conjure fuel or shells. Discipline could not replace destroyed bridges or shattered divisions. The air war was decisive. Allied aircraft dominated every hour of daylight. German troops learned to freeze at the sound of engines overhead, knowing that movement meant destruction. Vehicles were abandoned, camouflaged, or destroyed by their own crews to avoid detection. The battlefield belonged to the side that controlled the sky, and that control was absolute. As June turned toward July, the German position in Normandy deteriorated rapidly. Losses mounted, morale collapsed. Veteran units that had once prided themselves on resilience now reported psychological exhaustion. Soldiers spoke openly of inevitability, a word that would have been unthinkable months earlier. What they were experiencing was not just defeat, but revelation. Normandy revealed that modern war had changed its nature. Victory no longer belonged to those who fought hardest or longest. It belonged to those who could sustain violence indefinitely, who could replace men, machines, and munitions faster than the enemy could destroy them. Germany could not. And with that realization, the outcome of the campaign was no longer in doubt. The only remaining question was how long the destruction would continue before the end became undeniable. The answer would come soon. By late July, the German front in Normandy no longer resembled a coherent defensive line. It was a patchwork of exhausted units, shattered formations, and improvised positions held together by habit rather than hope. The language used in situation reports shifted noticeably. Where earlier messages spoke of counterattacks and stabilization, now they spoke of survival, withdrawal, and delay. Time itself had become the only objective. The Allied buildup had reached a scale that defied comparison. Artificial harbors were operating. Ports, once thought defensible for months, were falling in days. Supply ships queued offshore in orderly lines, unloading with mechanical precision. Tanks rolled directly from landing ships into battle. Artillery parks appeared almost overnight. The invasion force was no longer an expeditionary army. It was a continental machine, fully established and accelerating. German attempts to influence the battle through local successes only highlighted the disparity. Individual tank aces still achieved dramatic victories, destroying multiple enemy vehicles in minutes. These actions were seized upon by propaganda and celebrated as proof of resilience. But on the battlefield, they changed nothing. Destroyed Allied tanks were replaced within hours. Destroyed German tanks were gone forever. Tactical brilliance could no longer compensate for strategic impossibility. The collapse accelerated after the Allied breakout. When the bombing began, it was unlike anything German troops had endured. Entire sectors were obliterated under concentrated air power. Survivors described a landscape turned into raw earth and twisted metal. Commanders reported divisions effectively erased, not routed, but annihilated as functioning units. Men stumbled out of the bombardment deafened, disoriented, incapable of coordinated action. In these conditions, resistance lost its meaning. Orders continued to arrive, demanding counterattacks that could not be mounted. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was scarce. Vehicles lay destroyed or abandoned. Infantry moved on foot through a battlefield dominated by aircraft and artillery. Every attempt to regroup was detected and crushed. Every retreat was punished. The battlefield itself had become hostile to the defenders. As German forces attempted to withdraw, they encountered a final catastrophe. Escape routes narrowed. Allied pressure closed from multiple directions. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a systematic destruction. Roads became killing grounds. Columns were attacked repeatedly from the air. Wreckage piled so densely that movement became impossible. Soldiers hid in ditches, forests, anywhere they could, waiting for darkness or surrender. Those who survived described the experience as apocalyptic. Burning vehicles lined the roads. Dead horses lay among shattered equipment. The air smelled of fuel, smoke, and decay. Attacks came in waves, timed and relentless. There was no safe moment, no safe place. The enemy did not need to see individual soldiers. The landscape itself was targeted, reduced, and controlled. When the encirclement finally collapsed, tens of thousands were captured. Others lay dead where they had fallen. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The German army in Normandy had not been defeated in a single decisive engagement, but dismantled piece by an opponent who could afford to apply pressure everywhere at once. In the aftermath, senior German officers struggled to explain what had happened. The language of heroism and sacrifice rang hollow against the evidence. Courage had not been absent. Discipline had not failed. What had failed was the assumption that these qualities could overcome material disparity. Normandy proved that they could not. Post-war reflections from survivors returned again and again to the same theme. They had expected to face an enemy bound by hesitation, internal division, and limited means. Instead, they encountered a system optimized for war, production lines that never stopped, logistics networks that adapted instantly, command structures flexible enough to exploit success and absorb failure without collapse. For many German soldiers, the psychological shock lingered long after the fighting ended. Normandy destroyed not just units but beliefs. It invalidated years of doctrine and propaganda. The idea that willpower alone could determine victory collapsed in the face of arithmetic: shells fired versus shells produced, tanks destroyed versus tanks replaced, men lost versus men trained and deployed. In private writings and later interviews, veterans spoke with unexpected clarity. They did not blame individual leaders or single decisions. They described a confrontation with inevitability, a realization that the war had been lost, not on the beaches, but in factories years earlier, that the outcome had been determined by production curves and shipping schedules long before the first landing craft touched sand. Normandy marked the moment when that truth became undeniable. The soldiers who manned the bunkers on June 6 began the day convinced they were witnessing an invasion that would fail. By the end of the campaign, they understood they had witnessed the future of warfare, a future in which wars were decided by societies, not armies alone, by output, not ideology, by logistics, not slogans. They had fought with everything they had. They had fired until barrels warped, until ammunition ran out, until resistance became meaningless, and still the enemy came on, unchanged, unbroken, and growing stronger by the hour. The beaches of Normandy became more than a battlefield. They became a demonstration, a proof that in the age of industrial war, courage without capacity was a dead end. For Germany, the campaign was not just a defeat. It was a revelation that came too late to change the outcome. The war would continue for months. The fighting would grow even more destructive. But in Normandy, the ending had already been written, not in strategy rooms, not in speeches, but in factories.